We left Unalaska in the spring of 1821 as part of a small trading venture, skiffs and a sloop laden with seal pelts, iron goods, and whale oil lanterns. That night, off a windswept spit in the Aleutian chain, something we could not name rose from the black water, a cold, steady light that turned our charts and precautions into useless things. Warnings from our Aleut hunters and the skies low, electric hush told me we had stumbled on a danger that belonged to the sea itself. We were a small band of Russian fur traders and Aleut hunters aboard our sloop, provisions stowed, salted meat, barrels of whale oil and iron nails, and towing 2 baidarkas for shore work. Our captain navigated by compass, sextant, and a handwritten coastal chart. In early May of 1821, we worked the western approaches of Unalaska, exchanging goods for furs and trusting local knowledge of currents and kelp beds to find sheltered anchorages. The routine was plain and exacting: a watch at the masthead, soundings with the lead line, mending nets by whale oil light, the measuring of latitude and the small calculations in the chart's margin. Captain Petrov kept the ship's log. I kept a rougher note for myself. Weather that turned in an hour. The kelp hung like black ribbons. The cough of men cramped in the hold. Our Aleut hunters read the water differently. Small of frame and quick with a paddle, they pointed at eddies and named shoals with a glance. They carried the scent of smoked hair and seal oil and sang a low song while preparing lines to shore. That evening, we lay leeward of the spit, the sloop hunkered to steady north wind. The sky was a low, broken ceiling, and the air tasted metallic, though no rain fell. We trimmed sails and tested the whale oil lanterns. Men checked flint and tinder, and the baidarka crews took their paddles. I remember the sextant cold beneath my glove and the horizon made uncertain by the dim light. Our compass quivered as if to an unseen pulse. Talk dwindled to careful whispers. The hunters kept to the stern, faces turned to the water. A young deckhand, his beard still thin, warmed his hands on a cup of tea and watched with the hollow attention of a man used to waiting. We had traded for kelp oil that day, its acrid smell mixed with salt and the iron tang of stacked nails. A dog slept in the afterlocker and snorted. Then the light rose. It came not as flare, but as a slow thought from under the surface. Cold, steady, the color of ground glass. It moved along the kelp beds and made the sea's skin appear as dull pewter pierced by a pinpoint. The hunters stood without sound. Captain Petrov cursed and ordered the anchor heaved. He took the lead line and sounded while men made ready. The baidarkas were lashed, but could be cast loose in moments, their narrow frames rocked by the sloop side. No creature we knew moved there. No whale, no shoal of fish. Yet the light followed the kelp as if walking. An unease settled on us like a wet cloak. The sky seemed to lean nearer, and our charts, those rectangles of knowledge, felt like fragile talismans before a sea that obeyed other laws. We prepared to put to sea, uncertain whether to flee or to approach, and in hesitation, the hunter at the stern spat and murmured a name I did not know. His voice bore an older warning kept in bone and water. A northeasterly fog bank crept off the Bering Sea that evening, bringing a fine salt drizzle that plastered our sails and made the basalt cliffs vanish into a single indifferent grey. We had been sounding the lead line with a steadier hand than custom. Every cast gave us the same thin report of depth and a slick black mud on the leather cup. The Aleut hunters, who had come aboard to trade skin and skill for iron and beads, muttered among themselves of a low humming autumn tide that had come early. Such talk I set down without superstition, for they had been at sea longer than most of my crew had lived still. The sound took hold of the deck as an animal takes hold of scent. Small, unnatural details unsettled us. Seabirds, those faithful markers of fish and shoal, vanished by the dozen, wheeling once, then falling silent, as if the night itself had swallowed their cry. Our whale oil lanterns, mounted along the bulwarks and in the binnacle, burned with a steady, greasy light, yet seemed paler beneath some unearthly sheen on the water. The sheen lay like oil, or like a skin of moonlight that the fog would not disperse. When I leaned over the rail to peer, the planking of the deck tasted of salt and old tar, and my fingers grew numb to the chill. We kept to the old discipline, the mate trimming sail, the helmsman with his hands steady upon the tiller, sextant and chronometer stowed beneath the compass box, lest the wet spoil them. I had with me a logbook, a pencil stub, and a small brass spyglass. The Aleut hunters tended their kayaks lashed to the lee, their prized toggling harpoons wrapped in oiled cloth. We had brought trade, iron hatchets, small looking glasses, coarse cloth, and we had brought food for winter, salted fish, pemmican, flour. For the moment, these things felt remarkably distant. The humming grew audible sometime after midnight, a low, continuous note that did not rise and did not fall, as if a bell was being held under water. It was not wind, which came in fitful gusts, nor the creak of rigging it pressed the ribs of the ship in a manner that made the marrow ache. We hauled the lead again and again, noting the depth with the solemnity of men who count on numbers when words fail them. The line came up heavy, and dark flaked upon its leather were fine fragments of phosphorescent slime that clung to the hand as if alive. Then the light came. I saw it first as a pale, steady glow upon the water some 50 yards off, a lamp perhaps set upon a floating post. As it drew nearer, the oil of our lanterns seemed washed out, reduced to outline by that greater, colder light. The glow was not the yellow of flame, but a crystalline, silver, contained and steady. It did not dance with the wind, nor did it flicker when the fog thickened. Around it, the sea itself took on a lattice of faint luminescence, as if the water were threaded with veins of glass. The hunters went to their gear with soft, measured motions. One of them, whose name I knew to be Miklag, checked the edge of his ulu, and then looked at me with an expression I have since thought of often. Neither fear nor bravado, but the calculation of a man who has seen the sea in all its moods and knows when to step forward and when to stay back. I took the ship's whaleboat, fitted 2 oars, and ordered 2 men to come. I placed a small pistol and a boarding knife beneath my coat. Their weight was a comfort. We lowered the boat into that glassy, humming sea. The oars slipped through water that offered no spray, only a cool film that left the blades coated in light. As we pulled, the sound, low and constant, founded itself in the chest like a lived-in thing. The luminous lantern sat upon the water like a buoy, but when we were within 10 yards of it, I could make out no means by which it floated. No timbers, no chain, no shadow to betray a keel. Beneath its radiance, the fog took on the likeness of slow-moving scales. Something moved there, just beyond the flare, an outline that suggested breadth rather than length, shifting with a patient deliberation. I ordered the men to bring the boat alongside, to touch whatever this was with a pole. Their faces were pale under the grain of their beards. I felt a tremor in my hands I could not attribute to cold. The poles struck water, and then air, and then, with a sound like struck glass, the humming deepened. The light pulsed once, then twice, and I remembered only the boatman's quiet exhalation and the sudden absolute silence that followed, as if the sea had held its breath. We were not yet frightened in the way men become in war or storm. We were, rather, kept at the precise edge of attention as hunters poised upon a scent. Behind us, the ship lurched where those aboard hurried to the rail. The Aleut hunters' voices rose, low and urgent. In that held moment, I made the decision, whether from duty or curiosity I cannot say, and ordered us back to the small safety of the ship. The oars found the water, but the return was not simple. The luminous sea lantern, if that is what it was, did not remain where we had left it. It drifted inexorably and without wake between us and the ship, and the humming took on a higher register, threading our bones with a promise that something larger lay beneath. As we approached the ladder, I could feel the currents around the boat shifting, pulling at the hull as if to impede flight. We reached the ladder and hauled the boat alongside with hands that had steadied ships through squalls and ice. No man on that deck spoke more than a breath. We hauled the lines, lashed the boat, and watched as the glow moved away, sliding like a lamp borne upon an invisible current toward the dark throat of the channel. I set down the logbook and made my hands steady enough to write the hour. The men set double watches and battened what little canvas we had left. The night narrowed to the single fact of that light, and the low, unceasing hum that followed it, as if the sea itself had a lantern burning far below our keel. We made ready a small trading party at dawn, men sewn into their oilskins, bidarkas lashed to the longboat, and a single hand-bearing lantern set in the stern to keep the deck from absolute dark. The casks and bale goods were lashed with tarred rope, the sounding lead coiled by the helmsman, and I set the logbook upon my knees, the quill damp with ink I feared would not dry in the damp air. It was July of 1821, off the lee of Unalaska. The wind lay easterly, and a low fog hugged the kelp beds, like a thing that might crawl ashore if given light. We pushed off in 2 skiffs, men's breath making little ghosts in the blue light that clung to the paddles. At first, I thought the glow was nothing but the common phosphorescence one finds when the sea is warm with animal life. But this was unlike any remedy of plankton I had learned to read. Luminous splotches clung to the kelp and to the trailing edge of our oars, as if some cold hand had daubed them with lamp gleam. The light gave no warmth. To put a finger into it was to feel a sudden numbness that crept up the joints. Borin, my mate, drew his hand back white about the knuckles and swore under his breath. "Bring the compass," he said, and when he held it close to the brightest patch, the needle quivered as though some hidden lodestone had been drawn near. I took the lead line in my hands for the soundings. Ordinarily, the lead whispered water and then struck with a familiar pluck as the spool took it in. But when Borin dropped the lead this time, the rope slid without a sound. I watched the weight vanish and the line fall through a water that made no note upon the spool. No drip, no slap, only the blue washed upon the line as though the sea itself had become a sheet of cold glass. Whispers followed us in the boat, old superstitions of the Aleut and the sailor's own litany. A patch of tarred rope glistened as though washed in oil that could not be wiped away. We rubbed at it with our palms, and the tar remained glossy and implacable. The lantern at the stern burned as it should, its flame steady, yet it did not dispel the blue. The smell of tallow and damp kelp mixed with a metallic tang that made us all frown. The men checked their fowling pieces and knives with hands that trembled not from the cold, but from something else. I put quill to paper in the small light of the lantern and found my hand would not steady. The strokes of my ink ran thin where my fingers refused to hold the quill firm. I recorded the observations with the care of a man who knew the later usefulness of detail. The date written, the bearing from the shore, the depth that made no sound, the compass needle's agitation. Each entry seemed to make the air about us heavier, as if the act of naming gave substance to what we saw. We tried to procure a specimen. One of the Aleut hunters reached with a boathook toward a splotch that trailed from a tuft of kelp. The pole shivered in his grasp, and the tip came away with a smear that smelled faintly of copper and seaweed. He motioned for me to come and look, but when I leaned forward, the blue light stained his face like cold fire, and my eyes stung. He withdrew his hand and set the pole down as if embarrassed. No man spoke of what he had smelled, but all had seen the same small, stubborn gleam on the rope and on the oar blades and along the hull. As the day crept on, the phosphorescence increased in places, gathering like little beacons along the kelp grounds. The men, who had been quick with jokes and curses at dawn, sat now in a circle of silence and kept watch upon the water. We debated the sensible courses: return to the vessel, fetch the larger boat, test the sea with more lead. In the end, we agreed to make one careful advance, to row toward the brightest patch and lower the sounding lead again. Our oars dragged through the luminous trail, a procession of pale light marking our progress, and each man felt the numbness that the glow imparted. I remember thinking, with the slow certitude of a man who has seen too many charts altered by storms, that we were no longer counting paces upon known maps, but measuring towards something that would or would not answer our questions. We rowed on, the compass still a quivering thing between Boren's fingers, the lead line ready at my knee, the logbook closed and heavy in my lap, and as we neared the source of the glow, the kelp parted like curtains, and the night itself seemed to peer back at us. We had scarce time to assemble the trading party. By dusk, the longboat and 3 baidarkas were lashed alongside the St. Nicholas. The hold stank faintly of seal oil and dried fish, casks of tobacco, and stray bundles of sable fur lashed to the grating. Captain Voronin moved among us with the logbook tucked under his arm and a sextant at his hip, his cheeks wind-burnt and his breath a thin cloud in the cold. The Aleut hunters fitted their gut-skins and adjusted the padded thwarts of their baidarkas. I checked the flints of my musket, felt the rough rope of the harpoons, and set my oil and turn where the damp could not smother it. The wind lay to the north, soft as a threat, and the kelp drifted dark as hair across the sea's black. Before midnight, and without the warning of bell or foghorn, a globe of pale, steady light rose from the water like a lantern unmoored. It was the size of a ship's barrel and skated the surface where the kelp drifted, its low sheen illuminating the blades and casting silver on the ribs of the baidarkas. It moved without wake and hummed low enough to feel through the timbers. The sound was not of any bell I had known, but a deep, vibrating tone that set the marrow in my teeth to singing. We shoved off the baidarkas and beat a retreat, but it kept pace alongside the hull, its reflection cutting the spray and turning frightened faces into pale masks as men reached for muskets, and the captain shouted orders we could not trust. Voronin ordered the helmsman to fall back to deeper water. I saw his hand shake as he pointed toward the lantern, and then, in a manner I have since considered rash, he commanded a volley to be fired as if to drive off a marauder. The muskets cracked and the air filled with the acrid bite of black powder. The light did not waver. Where shot struck the water, there rose only a thin hiss, and the faintest scattering of phosphor along the surface, no wound, no flinch, no plume of steam as from a struck hull. The Baidarkas hugged the St. Nicholas, men kneeling, oars drummed against ribs, breath steaming like prayer. The Aleuts spat into the sea and called softly among themselves. They made signs with fingers. 3 pulled across the throat. And I understood then they were not speaking of a beast they could bash with clubs. Their leader, Maxi, gripped his paddle and peered into the globe as one who reads the weather in the clouds. The hum deepened. Through the planking, I felt it as a pressure, as if the sea itself were pressing its forehead to the keel. A smell of bent and brine reached us. Not decay, but a peculiar sweetness, like the smell on a wet stone when sun hits it after a storm. We hauled in the Baidarkas and made for the quarterdeck, piling casks and bundles against the rail. Voronin spoke in clipped Russian to the first mate, but his words were thin with fear I could read without translation. Do we follow? Do we flee? The men looked to me, though I am but a clerk, not a captain, and I found myself counting reasons to remain. Trade owed us coined the furs in the hold bought bread for families in Irkutsk. Yet there was an elder among the crew, a salt white as the kelp, who covered his head with a rough jacket and muttered that the sea lantern was no thing of commerce, but of omen. The globe skirted the kelp beds as if avoiding the fronds, casting long wavering shadows like the fingers of the dead. Once it paused directly astern, and I swear I saw within it no shape, only a darker core, as if something had folded itself away from sight. A small boat's bell began to toll on shore, faint and oddly timed. Men clutched at pikes and oars. 3 of the Aleuts made ready their toggled spears, though their hands trembled. We had provisions for weeks, and charts showing current and shoal our compass needle still wavered true. Yet none of our instruments accounted for a thing that moved from beneath the skin of the sea and hummed in our bones. Voronin made the command to weigh anchor and put to sea toward the channel. We backed the sails, and the St. Nicholas groaned as she swung into the swell. The globe matched our course without haste, keeping the same respectful distance, neither pursuing nor receding. It cast a cold light over the faces of the crew and the glistening kelp, and in that light I counted the men. 20, 2 souls and 2 boys, and 1 figure perched at the bow who had not taken a turn at the oars once, whose eyes remained fixed on the sea lantern as if in negotiation. We steered for open water. The kelp thinned. The hum changed its pitch, and the timbers underfoot answered like a bell. Somewhere aft, a musket fell and rolled to the scupper. Nobody reached for it. I set my hand on Max's shoulder, and he looked at me with the long, patient look of those who have read tidal signs in their mother's songs. No man spoke above a whisper. Ahead lay a narrow channel between black rock, and beyond it the world we were promised by charts. Behind us the sea lantern did not hurry, but it held its place, a pale companion keeping pace as if to ensure we kept our appointed path. We could not tell whether it was guiding or guarding. The St. Nicholas drove on. The spray rang cold against our faces, and I recorded each moment because memory alone seemed an unreliable candle in that wind. The trading party assembled before first light, men rubbing sleep from their eyes, while the cook stoked the galley fire, and the boatswain checked the rigging with fingers already raw from tar and rope. We took our bearings by the glass of the sextant, and by an old brass chronometer kept tucked beneath the binnacle. The chart of that spit was folded and creased, notes added in pencil where rocks lay like teeth. At dawn, we made for open sea and sailed hard under a full canvas. The great mainsail bellied like a lung, and the ship's timbers answering with that old, honest groan that marks a wooden hull in motion. The wind came bitter off the Aleutian chain, cold and salted, and the smell of pitch and wet wool sat on the air. The compass, fickle the night before, held its needle steady at last. Men checked it twice, once by the binnacle and once by the lead line. The lead came up smelling of kelp and the depth as we had expected. We kept one man ashore, as ordered, a sturdy fellow named Andre, who lay low among the tussocks to watch for any movement on the spit and to guard the barter goods until we made clear. He took with him a spare musket and a small keg of rum, for courage or for barter his face, when last I saw it, was set and pale. But he gave me a nod that spoke of duty rather than fear. We sailed until the lantern fell away. It detached from the spit as if some invisible hand unhooked it and set it adrift, a bright, calm flame the colour of whale oil, but steadier, like a polished coin in the dark. For a long while it kept pace with us, neither gaining nor losing, hung on the black water as if the sea itself had caught fire in a single ragged patch. The men were quiet then, the usual chatter stilled to watchfulness. Canvas flapped with measured regularity, the swell rolled under the hull, and the only other sound was the creak of blocks and the occasional hiss of salt as it took the rigging. When the lantern drew nearer, it began to affect our instruments. The compass, which had been true for hours, wavered as though a foreign magnet had passed beneath the hull. The needle quivered and then described a slow, insistent circle. We checked the chronometer against the sun and the sextant and found our noon sights crooked to one another by a hair. Small errors, but the kind a navigator notes and does not ignore. I took pen and sketched the light's position and the bearings as best I could, for a chartmaker's faith lies in ink and measurement more than in story. The wind played with the light. It seemed to bob, like a buoy untethered, now close enough that one might have reached for it, now slipping away into the low cloud. We bore off under full sail, for the men were less bold than curious, and curiosity can be costlier in those latitudes. The lantern held its place until we could no longer see the spit's low line against the grey sky. Then, as if a hand had been withdrawn, it fell away and left us with the ordinary black. The compass immediately steadied, the needle returned to its patient pointing, and the chronometer and sextant reconciled their differences when next we took sight. We trusted instruments in that hour as men trust trade and table, and when they sang true again, we breathed, though not as we had before. Andre stayed. He would later tell me, long after the casks were emptied and the tongues had loosened, that the Aleuts would not approach that spit for a year. He described, in quiet tones, footprints in the sand that ended as though the ground had swallowed them, and an absence of bird life where once there had been nests. I recorded his report in the ship's log, with the sketches and measured bearings, the ink smudged at times by a hand that had not quite stopped trembling. The traders who survived spoke of that night for years, in lantern-lit taverns and in the sturdy quiet of coastal sheds, and the light became part of their cautionary tales and my own quiet study. It left no bodies and no satisfying explanation, only a recorded moment when something of the Aleutian dark revealed itself and refused our names. We sailed on, as traders must, with sails patched and stores counted, but the spit entered the ledger of superstition as surely as it had our charts. Even now, when I touch the page where I made those measured strokes, the ink seems to hold a chill, and the question of what watched from the lesser black of those shores follows the men I sailed with like a shadow, unsettled, unnamed, and not yet laid to rest.